The rain whispered across the canvas like soft breath from the heavens. Not harsh, not violent, but relentless. Each drop struck with purpose, like fingers drumming against the past. The storm didn't rage. It mourned. And within that mourning, inside the sagging walls of a tattered tent, history bent its spine over ink and ash. He sat alone, the scribe, not a man of sword or shield, but of silence. His robe clung to him, damp with the breath of the storm, its fabric heavy with old salt and soot. The candle beside him fought against the damp, its light dancing like a ghost across the canvas walls, reaching for corners that hadn't known warmth in weeks. His hands trembled as he dipped the quill into the inkpot, not from cold, but from memory. His fingers, stained darker than the night outside, had once written poetry. Now they only marked absence. Scrolls were spread before him like the innards of a broken beast, names curled in script, numbers etched with care. Not accounts of triumph. These were debts. Debts owed not only in coins, but in lives. The names of men who had vanished beneath mud and frost, who were swallowed by the land they swore to defend. No hymns sung for them, no graves marked, just disappearing footprints in soil too tired to remember. He paused, the nib of his quill hovering. The candlelight caught in his eyes rimmed red from nights not spent weeping, but watching. Watching villages vanish from census rolls. Watching the names of the faithful become footnotes. Watching a people's breath fade into parchment, and knowing he was the only one left to hold their memory behind him. The old kettle hissed, not boiling, but simmering like some beast denied its howl. The smell of root broth hung thick, earthy, and bitter, mingling with the wet wool stench of the scribe's own robes. The stew was not for nourishment. It was a ritual, a small act of resistance against the void creeping ever closer. Rain beat steadily on the canvas, a cadence of time. Running out. The war, for others, was fought with steel. For him, it was fought with silence. With pages left blank, because no one remained to name. With letters sealed, but never sent. Like the one lying in the corner, wrapped in red thread. It had waited. Longer than most men lived. A name on that letter had once meant something. Perhaps a brother, a friend. Perhaps a sin. He turned to it now. Not with resolve, but surrender. Outside, a falcon called from the black woods. Its cry pierced through the patter of rain, sharp, sudden, and unanswered. No other voices stirred. The camp beyond the tent was sleeping or pretending. The fires were low, barely keeping the dark at bay. And somewhere past the tree line, where the graves grew shallow and unblessed, the dead remained still, no haunting, no moans, just the memory of breath in the trees. He reached for his quill again, not to tally rations or record orders. This was different. He unrolled a fresh scrap of parchment, thinner than the others, almost translucent under the candle's flicker. He wrote slowly, carefully, as though the ink itself would judge the truth of his words. Not a chronicle, a confession. He wrote the names he omitted. Of the man he let go, a deserter, perhaps innocent. Of the village he never reported lost, for fear it would be burned again. Of the lie he told a boy at the gate. "Your father lives," he had said. He wrote it all, each line heavy as stone, until the parchment sagged under the weight of guilt. Outside, the falcon cried again. Weaker this time, or further away. The candle leaned low, its flame shrinking. And the scribe leaned too, over his final words, over the confession he'd hidden inside himself longer than he'd dared admit. He pressed the parchment flat with both palms, as if trying to hold it down from flying away. He didn't fold it. He didn't seal it. It was not meant to be sent. He sat back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in many winters, he slept. The rain continued its whisper. The fire hissed its quiet discontent. And somewhere in the dark, under branches heavy with moss and thyme, the silence turned inward, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. By dawn, The ink had dried, the sealed letter remained unopened, but the new one lay on top, bare, trembling, honest. It would not change the past, but it would make the reckoning real. A writer would find it before sunset. And what he read would pull at the roots of power like a storm pulling at an old banner, faded, forgotten, but never truly still. The fire had dwindled to embers, red and pulsing like the last breath of a wounded heart. It gave no warmth now, only light, low, flickering, uncertain. The storm outside had softened into a whisper, but the mud still sucked at her boots as she approached, each step slower than the last. Her dress, once the color of wheat at harvest, now clung to her legs like old bandages. Rain had soaked it through, and ash had stained its edges. The journey had stripped her of everything but purpose. She stood just beyond the tense shadow, breathing in the scent of smoke and damp canvas. Not a sound came from within. No shuffling of parchment. No soft cough, no rustle of movement. Just the kind of silence that follows a reckoning. The kind that waits to see what the living will do next. When she lifted the flap, a curl of mist swept in with her, as though the night itself tried to follow. She ducked low and stepped inside. Her satchel dropped softly by the entrance, heavy with road and memory. The air inside was warmer than she expected, thick with the scent of tallow and old leather. The brazier in the center glowed dimly, casting shadows against the canvas walls like the flickering remnants of forgotten banners. There he was, the scribe, asleep, if sleep could be trusted. His hands rested on his lap, fingers still ink-stained, curled like dead leaves over the parchment he'd been writing when sleep overtook him. His face was gaunt, hollowed by nights like this, by words too heavy to carry and too dangerous to leave behind. She did not wake him. She knelt instead, slowly, the mud cracking at her knees as she moved. Her hands, trembling with fatigue, unwrapped the linen bundle she had carried like a relic, close to her chest for 3 days and nights. The cloth was wet, but the thing inside was dry. A figurine, carved from dark wood, smooth with years of touch. A knight on one knee before a tree, a sacred image, outlawed now, condemned as heresy. But to her, it was not treason. It was a memory. It was faith. She placed it beside the brazier. For a while, she simply watched the glow reflect off the figure's bowed head. Then she peeled off her gloves, fingers clumsy and stiff. The cloth bindings beneath were fraying, their knots swollen with damp. Her hands were marked, not freshly wounded, but long since torn. The scars had stories, each one a name. Each choice she could not take back. She breathed deep. The smell of burning roots and boiled hide filled her lungs. The tent was a monument to a life unraveling. A cracked bowl lay beside the sleeping man, filled with river stones, worn smooth, perhaps once carried from village to village like tokens. A torn map was pinned to the canvas wall, the roads marked not in ink, but with bone needles. And a banner, tattered, sun-faded, draped along the back, stitched with a crest she had never seen before. None of it told her what she needed, but she had not come for signs. She had come for silence, and the story locked inside it. The fire crackled once, and she looked toward the parchment on his lap, words still wet, lines ending mid-thought. A name had begun to form at the bottom, but the ink dragged away like a breath interrupted. She wondered what it would say. If it was hers. A gust outside tugged at the tent. The flap whispered against itself, and the brazier guttered. She reached forward and cupped her hands around the wooden figure, as if shielding it from the wind, or from the eyes of gods that no longer watched. Her voice, when it came, was no louder than the rain on canvas. "Do you still remember him?" The scribe stirred but did not wake. She didn't repeat the question. It was not for him. It was for herself. For the girl she had been once. For the man who knelt in that wooden carving. For the vow they had made under a tree, now burned to ash. She closed her eyes and heard the storm's quiet rhythm. In it, She could almost hear hooves on frozen soil. Swords unsheathed in sorrow, not anger. A prayer whispered in a language no longer spoken aloud. She would wait. She had walked through kingdoms to arrive here, through betrayal, through ruin. She had buried names and faces, burned letters that might have saved her, and watched her own reflection fade into someone she no longer recognized. But this tent, this moment, was where it began again, somewhere in the folds of that parchment, in the breath of a sleeping scribe, in the smoke curling over an outlawed relic. The truth still waited. And when he woke, she would ask. Not with rage, not with desperation, but with the quiet strength of someone who had nothing to lose. Outside, the storm deepened, no longer a threat, but a witness. The fire gave one last sigh of warmth. And the carving, lit faintly from below, cast a long soft shadow, the shape of a knight kneeling not in defeat, but in remembrance. The candle had died in the night. Its wax had pooled and hardened, a pale bloom in the shadows. The cold ashes curled in the brazier like the remnants of a whispered prayer, clinging to the fabric of the air. Outside, the world still held its breath. Not yet dawn, but not fully night. That strange, silent hour when the dead feel closest. A thin line of blue crept beneath the edge of the tent, soft as smoke, brushing the floor like the hem of a forgotten robe. He stirred slowly, no sharp breath, no jolt. Just the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had survived too many mornings to welcome another. His body no longer obeyed the rhythm of war. It moved now with the ache of memory. The parchment he'd fallen asleep over had slipped to the ground, the ink running in places where his hand had rested. He retrieved it with a grunt, squinting through the blur. The names stared back at him, not shouted, not carved in stone, but scribbled in margins, tucked between the lines of orders no one followed. Men who had vanished into the silence between battles. Men who carried things without a sword, could cut free. He set the parchment aside and reached for the tin cup by his bed. Rainwater, caught in a cracked bowl. It tasted of smoke and canvas and the kind of stillness only found after fire. He drank slowly, letting it settle behind his ribs like a stone dropped into deep water. Then he saw it near the brazier. Beside the soft ash, the figurine. A knight, kneeling before a tree. Carved in the old style, dark wood worn smooth with time. It hadn't been there when he closed his eyes. His hands stilled. The breath in his throat caught, not from fear, but recognition. That image. He had seen it before. Not in a book, not in a dream, but in blood. A chapel years ago. A roof fell in. Firelight licking broken beams. A knight lay dying beneath the altar, his hand wrapped around this very carving, the blood running fast from a wound no healer could mend. That man's name still lived in the back of the scribe's throat, never spoken, never forgotten. His saddle, still rolled at the edge of the tent, held the last stains of that night. And now the carving has returned. He didn't need to ask who had placed it there. Some knowledge arrives not through logic, but through something deeper. The ache in the bones, the weight behind the ribs. He knew she had come. The woman who walked alone, always toward the past. The question was not who. The question was why now. He stood, joints crackling beneath the strain of years, lived hunched in ink and regret. The tent creaked softly around him. He moved to the flap and paused, listening. The rain had softened to a mist, light enough to forget, heavy enough to cling. He opened the canvas and stepped outside. The world beyond was veiled in gray. The kind of morning that didn't rise, but unfolded, slow, uncertain, like a secret. Smoke trailed from dying campfires. Trees stood still and watchful, their leaves slick with ghostlight. Somewhere far away, a raven called once and fell. Silent, he lit a new candle, shielding the flame from the wind with his cupped hand. The light flared, fragile but sure, and then he waited. Because some ghosts returned screaming. blood on their lips. Others come wrapped in silence, bearing objects instead of answers. A token, a relic, a memory carved into wood. The figurine stared back at him from the ash. Its head bowed. He knew what it meant. She had not come for comfort, not for forgiveness. That she had come for the truth. And truth has its own kind of edge. Sharper than steel, quieter than prayer. He sat back on the rough wool mat, candle flickering between them, and waited for her steps in the mist. She would not knock. She would enter as she always had, with nothing but her silence, her eyes, and the question she had carried across kingdoms. And when she spoke, he would have to decide what parts of the past to give back. Some stories were not meant to be told. Some were all that remained. The silence between them was not born of hesitation. It was built from ruin. Thick, immovable, like stone fallen from a collapsed chapel wall. She sat beside the brazier, the firelight trembling across the hollows of her face. Her cloak hung behind her, steaming faintly in the cold air. Beneath it, the scars ran like rivers across her skin, pale against the grime and salt of long roads. The marks were old, yet still raw, not to the touch, but to memory. He watched her from across the flickering shadows. Her eyes hadn't moved from the coals since dawn. She hadn't blinked when he set the bowl of boiled grain before her, hadn't reached for the cup. She needed neither warmth nor sustenance, only the truth. Then finally she spoke. They burned the chapel with the children inside. The words struck like flint. No scream, no rage, just the simple sound of something broken too long ago to make noise when it falls. He did not answer. There was no answer, because he had been there. He had stood among the riders at the forest's edge, watched the roof sag and burn, heard the bell collapse mid-ring, silenced not by time, but by flame. His fingers had been tight around the reins, waiting for an order that never came, and when none arrived, he turned away and said nothing. He remembered the smoke, how it clung to the sky like a black ribbon trailing behind a soul. She reached slowly into her satchel. The fire crackled as she unfolded what she held, a sheet of vellum, thin, creased, half-torn, stained with age and mud. His name was on it. He knew what it was before she placed it in his hands. A confession, written by his own ink, his own trembling hand. 10 years ago, when he thought it would never be read. When he believed the truth, once buried, could be forgotten. You buried the truth under parchment, she said, eyes never leaving him. Now I need it spoken. The canvas rustled softly, drawn in by wind or fate. The dripping from the eaves grew louder, steady as a heartbeat. He stared at the letter. The lines of ink faded but clear. His handwriting, younger and sure. He had written of guilt then, thinking it enough. Words in darkness. Words for no one. He ran his thumb across the bottom of the vellum, over the signature. His name had once meant something. You came for justice, he murmured, as if testing whether the words still lived. No, she said. Justice died with them. Her voice didn't tremble. It was steadier than his breath. I came for remembrance. And that was heavier. That was sharper. For justice could be imagined, wielded like a sword. But remembrance, that stayed. It grew roots in the bones and whispered to the waking. It lived long after the fires died out. He looked up. Into her eyes. He remembered those eyes, not as they were now, lined with fury and silence, but younger, softer. A girl beneath orchard branches, singing to trees, feeding crows from her palm, naming each one like a friend. That girl had vanished the night the flames took the chapel. But something of her had endured, and it now sat before him, changed, scarred, but unbroken. I should have stopped them, he said, barely above a breath. But you didn't. No, he folded the vellum again. Not to hide it, but to feel the weight of it in his hands. They said the chapel was heresy, he whispered. That the children were being taught the old rites. that the tree was sacred to something older than the king. And so you watched them burn, she said. He nodded slowly. The brazier flared, and the smoke rose high into the tent's ceiling, curling like a spirit disturbed, like a name being spoken too late. Outside, the mist had returned. Soft footsteps passed beyond the canvas, soldiers changing watch, unaware of the reckoning unfolding inside. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Speak their names? Carve them into stone?" "No," she said, standing at last. Her shadow loomed long across the floor, her silhouette taller than it had ever been in youth. "You will carry them. And when the others come, the ones who claim to forget, you will make them remember." He bowed his head, and when they try to deny it? Her answer was a whisper, but it struck like thunder. "You'll show them. Your name beside theirs." He rose, slowly, every joint a reminder of time lost. The figurine still sat near the ashes, its wooden form warm now from the fire's breath. The knight kneeling at the foot of the tree, he reached down and took it into his hands. "I kept this," he said, "because I didn't know where else to place my guilt." "Now," she replied, her eyes fixed on the carving, "you place it with memory." The tent grew quiet again, but not empty. Something sacred had passed between them, not forgiveness, but reckoning, the kind that does not cleanse, but binds. And as the candle burned low, a shift moved through the camp. A stillness, expectant. Beyond the mist, others would come. Some, to silence the past. Others hear it, but for now there was only the fire, and the two of them. And the truth is no longer buried. The brazier flared one final time, smoke spiraling upward, a shape without name, rising toward the canvas like the spirit of something awakened. Night pressed down like a heavy hand, thick with the scent of pine smoke and damp soil. The rain had not stopped, only softened, a steady whisper against canvas and leaf, like the breath of something ancient refusing to fade. Inside the tent, the fire caught slow and low, fed by damp twigs that hissed before surrendering to flame. Its orange glow trembled across the walls, turning them into old parchment scrawled with shadows. Two figures sat in that flickering world, quiet, one on either side of the brazier. Neither spoke. Not yet. The air between them was full, not with words, but with things that had waited too long to be spoken. He crouched near the flame, his hands worn and scarred, the lines of age and grief carving his face deeper than time alone could explain. He moved with the care of someone used to breaking things, promises, trusts, hearts. And tonight, perhaps, silence too. She sat across from him, cloak wrapped tight, hair still damp with stormwater. Her hands were unwrapped now, resting in her lap. The skin was raw where cords had once bitten deep, red, cracked, and quiet. Scars left not in punishment, but in accusation. The kind given by men who did not ask questions. Only past sentences docked between them lay two relics. The wooden knight, bowed beneath the tree, and the vellum confession. Edges curled, the ink still legible despite the years. Not evidence, not anymore. These were sacred remnants of a story buried under ash and shame. The kind of story that doesn't beg to be told, but demands to be remembered. He spoke first, not with ceremony, just with memory. "I remember the orchard," he said, eyes on the coals. "You were always climbing the trees. The others were too afraid." She closed her eyes at the sound of it. "I climbed to listen to the wind," she said softly. It sounded different up there, cleaner. The rain ticked against the canvas like distant footfalls. The fire shifted, coiling around itself. He nodded. It did. Cleaner. A pause, then, "Do you still believe?" She opened her eyes, looked at him through the years. "In what?" she asked, in mercy. The question settled like dust in a crypt. A long silence followed. Not empty, just deep. Then, finally she answered, "Only because I've seen the opposite. The brazier. Cracked. A single ember rose into the air, dancing, then died before it touched the roof. He leaned back and reached into his satchel. From it, he drew a bone die, small, worn smooth, the pips faint from years of turning in restless palms. He rolled it across the floor between them. A 6. He rolled again. 1. Some men gamble with coins, he said. I gambled with silence. She didn't smile, but she leaned forward, reached out, and covered the die with her hand. Then speak, she said, her voice steady. While the fire still listens, he stared into the flames, then into her eyes, and he began, not a speech, not an apology, but a story, the real one. The things that hadn't made it into the confession. The names are not written. The decisions were made not from cruelty, but from cowardice. The moment he saw the chapel burning and turned away, he spoke of the orchard. 2. Of how, long before the war, he'd watched her feed the crows. How they trusted her. How she trusted the world. He told her about the old priest who taught him to write, and how his fingers shook when he forged the orders to keep the cavalry, waiting just a little too long. He spoke until his voice cracked, and still the rain kept falling. Still the fire kept listening. She didn't interrupt, only listened. When he finished, he stared down at the figurine, at the kneeling knight. I thought if I stayed silent long enough, it would fade, he said. The memory, the guilt, all of it. But silence, it doesn't wash things away, it preserves them. She looked at the die still under her hand, then at the vellum. You always wanted to be the one who decided who lived, she said. He nodded. Now, she whispered, you will remember the ones who didn't. And he nodded again, this time not in guilt, but in agreement. Outside, the storm deepened. Thunder in the far hills, the wind rising through the trees like a choir of the forgotten. But inside the tent, the flame steadied, no longer twisting, no longer hissing, a warmth now, and something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the truth. Spoken aloud, the kind that begins to undo what silence had held. He looked across the fire. She was no longer the girl from the orchard, and he, no longer the man who had turned away. They were something else now. The reckoning had begun, not with blades drawn, but with eyes open. And beyond the canvas, dawn waited, slow and gray and honest. By dawn, the valley was no longer land. It was a lake of mist, soft and silver, swallowing the trees and stones alike. The sun had not yet broken the line of the hills, but there was light. A cold, diffused glow that made every shape seem both present and not. The camp beyond the ridge lay still, muffled by fog and silence. No horses, no orders, only the hush that follows a night too heavy to forget. Inside the tent, the air was still. The storm had passed. What remained was the faint warmth of old coals, a dull red glow pulsing beneath ash, like the final breath of a dying star. The scent of smoke clung to everything, even to memory. He crouched by a wooden trunk, weathered by years and war. The iron clasp creaked as he opened it, and from within, he drew a cloth-wrapped book, thick, scorched, nearly broken at the spine. But it held. It had always held. He placed it between them on the ground, as one might place an offering at an altar. She looked at it, but did not reach for it. He spoke. This is the map of my cowardice, he said. No preface, no apology, only that. She stared at the cloth, then slowly unwrapped it. Her fingers touched the leather cover, dry, cracked, burnt at the edges. When she opened it, the pages whispered against one another, dry as leaves. It was not a coin or grain ledger, not records of rations or men. It was a memory, catalogued, bound. Each page held a place, a moment, a name, the villages raised under order, the faces turned away from, the cries ignored behind doors sealed tight. Each silence chosen and written down. She turned the pages with care, as if they might bleed. Why keep it? She asked, voice low. He did not lift his gaze from the floor. "To remember," he said, "and to hope someone might one day ask me to explain." She stopped on a page near the middle, one marked with a crimson seal, now faded but still visible. A single word written beside it in ink that time had not managed to erase. Aloan. Her hand trembled. Her lips parted, but she could not speak. The name spoke for her. "That was my mother's name," she said finally. He nodded. The coals shifted slightly. A faint hiss from the brazier. "She sheltered the wounded," he said. "Feed them. Hide the children in the root cellar beneath the chapel floor." When the soldiers came, she stood between them and the fire. She was hanged beside the well. His voice faltered. "I wrote her name last, after I wept." There was silence then, not the silence of withheld words, but of something old and sacred passing between them. Like a prayer or a burial, the fire cracked softly. She stood. Her boots made no sound on the tent floor. She paced the edge once, slowly, her breath fogging faintly before her mouth despite the heat. Her eyes did not hold rage anymore, only the long shadow of knowing. When she turned back to him, her face was pale with a kind of mercy that costs everything to give. "You've carried this long enough," she said. He met her gaze. Did not speak. Did not argue. She reached down and tore the crimson-marked page from the book, folded it once, and slipped it into her Tchel. He didn't stop her. He only bowed his head. Some truths are meant to be carried like stones in the heart, but others must be passed on. Not to preserve guilt, but to keep the memory of the innocent from vanishing like mist at dawn. Outside, the fog began to shift. A wind rose from the west, gentle and cold. It moved through the valley like a ghost stirring from sleep. Far off, the cry of a raven echoed once, then faded. He looked at her one last time, and she looked at him. Not as prisoner and captor, but as two who had walked through fire, and now stood in its cooling ash. She stepped outside into the mist, and he remained, alone with the coals, and the open book, and the names still left to explain. The next page waited. Somewhere beyond the fog, the sun was rising. The camp was waking. Metal clanged, the sharp ring of blade to blade as soldiers reheated the day. Horses snorted and stamped the soft earth, their breath white in the morning air. Crows circled overhead, calling out like sentries. And from beyond the hills, the sun began to rise, not golden, but blood-hued, casting a rust-colored glow across the dew-drenched grass. Yet inside the tent, the air was different, slower, heavier, as if time had thickened, unwilling to move until all was spoken. The fire in the brazier had shrunk to a single red eye. The smoke had thinned to the scent of ash and parchment. The world inside was quieter, softer, like the hush. After a grave has been filled, she stood at the entrance, the fabric of her cloak gathered tight around her shoulders. Her face turned toward the coming light, but her eyes did not follow it. They stayed fixed on the edge of morning, on the shape of what lay beyond. Beyond the river, another camp waited. Another gate. Another trial. There, her name was a stain. There, she was still a traitor. Her hands closed around the straps of her satchel. Inside were the artifacts of this night. A scorched ledger, a carved wooden figurine, a confession spoken in smoke, and the torn page bearing the name of her mother. Approached her quietly, carrying one last thing, a scroll, sealed but still soft from the ink. His fingers were smudged dark, the tips trembling slightly. "Take this," he said, voice low. "Not for them, but for the ones after." She unrolled the parchment enough to glimpse its contents. Not a plea, nor an excuse. Not a defense. Just names, dates, places, records of choices that could no longer be undone, only remembered. A witness to the truth, written not in hope of forgiveness, but so the silence might break, even after the voices were gone. She nodded once. "I don't need redemption," he said, "but I hope they remember I tried." She turned to him, eyes meeting him without the shield of rage or sorrow. Just silence. Deep, old silence. Then, redemption isn't yours to choose, she replied. But you've given me what I need to make it possible. A wind stirred. The canvas of the tent flapped open at her back, and light spilled in, pale but growing. She did not turn back. She stepped forward, letting the sun reach her face. Her skin caught the morning warmth, but her gaze remained. Cold and steady. She walked. Each step pressed into the wet grass, bending it low before the wind erased her path. There would be no trail, no footprints to follow. Only the burden she carried. In her satchel was not justice, for justice by now was a ruined word. What she bore was legacy, a memory sewn from the threads of ruin, a story that would cost her dearly to tell, and perhaps even more to survive. Behind her, he stood still in the doorway. He did not call after her, did not ask her to stay. The brazier behind him sputtered, its last ember dying into black. He turned slowly, back into the silence of the tent. The air was cool now, touched by the breeze. He moved to the chair and sat down once more, not like a man awaiting judgment, but like one who had already received it and accepted it. The morning pressed in, not with dread, but with weight. And for the first time in years, he did not feel hunted by it. He felt released. Outside, the wind picked up. It scattered ash across the clearing, lifted tents by their corners, tugged at cloaks and standards, alike. But she did not look back, and he did not rise. One carried the truth forward, the other stayed behind with what remained. From the hill, the river shimmered, silver and slow, and on the far bank, banners flickered in the wind. And somewhere, beyond the next fire, another choice waited. The tent was silent when he arrived, too silent for a place that once echoed with command. He ducked beneath the heavy flap, expecting to hear movement, voices, the rustle of maps unfurled, and arguments flung like blades. But inside, the air hung thick with ashen memory. The hearth had burned low, nothing left but a smear of red coal buried in gray. The smoke curled along the ceiling like a ghost that hadn't yet decided to leave. The man wore the south coat, crest. His boots were polished to a black gleam, his cloak stiff with salt from a long ride, his breath tinged with the sour bite of wine. His arrival had been swift, summoned by an urgency he did not question. He had ridden through rain, through night, through forests that whispered of things better left unseen. Now he stood at the center of the quiet, looking down. There, at the foot of the empty chair, sat a sealed wooden box, unadorned, plain, but heavy with intention. The seal had not been broken, though the wax bore no emblem, no crest, only a single deep line, like a wound pressed into red. He knelt, opened the box. Inside, he found no orders, no plans, no call to arms, just a letter, undated, unsigned, but alive with words that cut deeper than blades. It spoke not of strategy, but of sorrow. Not conquest, but destruction. Whole villages burned into nothing. Children's names erased from records as though they had never drawn breath. A monk who had turned on his own brethren, not for coin, not for power, but for belief. Twisted belief. The courier's brows tightened. This was not the message he was sent to retrieve. This was something else, something that did not belong in the halls of the southern court, because once read, it could never be unheard. Beside the letter lay the old ledger, its corners scorched, its ink faded, and the small wooden figurine, smoothed by years of touch. A child's toy, perhaps, or something once carried in a soldier's pocket for luck. He did not know what to make of them, but he took them. He gathered the letter, the ledger, and the figurine, folded them tightly in a cloth. He left the hearth as it was, smoldering, tired, forgotten. The tent flapped behind him like a torn banner in the wind. Outside, the air had changed. The night had teeth now. The trees whispered. Crows circled. Overhead, wings catching the last dim light. Watching, the courier mounted his horse. Leather creaked and hooves bit into the soft earth. He did not look back. The road south would take 3 days. Through river crossings and hollow woods, past border stones now half buried by time, he rode on, unaware that fate had already taken a different path. At the river's edge, just before dawn, unseen hands would rise from the shadows. They would take the cloth bundle, quietly, without confrontation. They would not harm him, only mislead him, gently. A tree hollowed by lightning would become a grave for memory. There, between roots knotted like prayerful hands, the truth would sleep. And yet, the story did not. Already, it had taken flight, in whispers between field hands, in ballads sung by girls too young to understand the names they recited, in painted symbols on doorposts, red circles where only ashes had been. And far from courts, far from command tents and blood-soaked ledgers, in a village untouched by maps, a woman knelt beside an old well. Her hands moved slowly, reverently. She placed a red thread around the stone lip of the well, tying it once, then again, a thread to remember, a thread not easily cut. Above her, the wind stirred the trees. Beneath her, water waited, silent and deep, holding echoes of names once spoken, now returned as ripples, and behind her, the path south darkened. But ahead, the story pressed on. The war ended not with cheers, nor with treaties sealed beneath gilded roofs, but with silence. No bells rang. No doves were lost into the sky. The blood simply stopped flowing, and the wind no longer carried the scent of burning. One morning, without warning, the last sword was lowered. The last campfire burned low. The banners, once bright with heraldry and pride, were quietly pulled down, folded like old sins, and never raised again. Time passed. The wounds, though deep, were hidden. Fields that once bore footprints of soldiers began to sprout again, green, soft, indifferent to what had once drenched them in red. Villagers returned to their chores. Children, who had only known the rhythm of fear, learned to laugh again, though the laughter always seemed to echo, never quite whole. Most forgot, or pretended to, but not all. Far from the beaten paths and the murmurs of courts, in the overgrown remains of an old chapel, long abandoned to ivy and rot, a young girl was gathering wildflowers when her hand brushed against something solid in the earth. She dug carefully, fingers brushing ash still soft beneath the moss. There, buried beneath the roots of a broken tree that had grown sideways into the chapel wall, lay a small wooden figurine, shaped like a knight on bended knee beneath a curved tree. There was no inscription, no name, just the shape, worn, smooth by time, by hands now gone. She brought it home, cradled in her palms like something sacred. Her grandmother, hunched by the fire, took it in silence. Her fingers trembled as they traced the shape. Her eyes filled not with surprise, but memory. "Where did you find it?" she whispered. "Near the roots," the girl replied. "It was buried in ash." The old woman nodded, slowly, as if she had always known this moment would come, that something lost would one day return, not loudly, not in glory, but quietly, in a child's hands. That night, she placed the figurine on the mantel, beside a dying sprig of rosemary. She lit a single candle, its flame soft and steady, and she spoke a name into the silence, not her own, but one she had carried like a weight across her years. In another town, far to the west, a priest repairing a crumbling chapel wall discovered a scroll sealed behind a loose stone. The parchment had yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the words still ached. He read them aloud, though no one listened. Then he copied them, carefully, and folded the copy into the lining of his robe. Each evening, after the last prayer had been said and the doors had been bolted, he would stand in the dark and read from the scroll to no one. The words were not meant to be loud. They were meant to survive, and so they did. The truth found no monument. No statue was ever raised for those who fell in silence, for those who chose memory over vengeance, but still, it moved Dot in the way a mother plaited her daughter's hair and hummed an old tune whose words had been lost. In the way a lantern was, hung on certain nights by certain windows facing east. In the hush that fell when thunder rolled over distant hills, Dot, and in the sound of rain tapping gently on canvas, on rooftops, on leaves, a rhythm carried across generations. Dot, no one remembered everything, but some remembered enough. Dot, and in that remembering, the war did not win. Dot, not truly. Dot, it lived on only in whispers. And sometimes that was enough to keep the soul of the story breathing. Somewhere, not far from the roots where the figurine had slept, a new tree had begun to grow. Its trunk was thin, its branches fragile, but it reached upward, toward the light. The night returned, as it always does, not with fury, not with thunder, but with softness. A gentle rain fell upon the canvas of the encampment, tapping lightly like old fingers on a forgotten door. The soldiers here were young, their faces unlined, their eyes lit with belief. They spoke of oaths and glory, of banners yet to be unfurled. Their boots were clean, their swords still untested. They did not know what it meant to wake in terror or bury a brother beneath the mud. But in one tent, apart from the others, another calm settled. Inside sat a boy with ink-stained fingers, a leather-bound book, and the patience of someone taught to listen more than speak. He was a scribe, barely a man, bent over a worn table, his breath slow, his quill steady. Dot, beside him stood a small wooden figure. Dot, it was not grand. No jewels adorned it. No one had carved their name into its base. Just a simple shape, a kneeling knight beneath a tree, worn smooth by time and hands that had passed it down in silence. A woman in her final season, high in the hills, had given it to him during a winter that cracked stones and silenced birds. She had handed it to him without explanation, only a whisper. "Keep it. It matters." She died the next morning. And he, not knowing what else to do, brought the figure with him. He did not know the story. Not truly. But sometimes when the camp had gone still, when the wine had run out and the rain tapped its slow rhythm, he would pause mid-sentence and feel as if something else sat within the tent with him. Not threatening, just watching. The canvas would shift gently in the breeze, the candlelight would flicker, and the air would hold a weight, not heavy, but present. The fire whispered in low tones, as though trying to remember something it had once seen. Dot, and then, across the valley, soft and sudden, a single bell rang. Dot, it rang not for battle, not for mass, not for kings. Dot, just for remembrance. Dot, there were no words, no procession. No one turned to ask who had struck it. But still, the sound carried, over hills, over rain, over graves no longer marked. Dot, and in the tent, the boy paused. His quill hovered. His breath slowed. For a moment, he did not copy. He did not think. He simply listened. Dot, because somehow, though the names had faded and the stories had cracked, he understood that something had once happened here. Something that mattered. The past was not gone. I was sleeping. Dot, waiting. Dot, and in that brief silence, beneath the hum of rain and the hush of flame, it stirred. A shadow in the corner, a memory in the smoke. The figure on the desk, bathed in flickering gold, seemed to lean just slightly forward, not by movement, but by meaning. Outside, the men laughed around their fires, sharpening blades for wars they had not yet seen. But inside this small flickering world of ink and wood and rain, a story breathed, and it waited. Dot, not for glory, not for vengeance, but for someone to ask what had been lost, and who had carried it so far. Dot, in the east, dawn began to bleed into the clouds, pale, uncertain. The bell stopped, but the silence it left was not empty. Dot, it was a door. And the boy, without knowing why, began to write a new page.